Good evening, and thank you for joining us this evening. The Reading League Michigan appreciates your time, attendance, and your interest in reading comprehension, and more than that, in advocating for literacy for all. Every student in the state of Michigan and across our country deserves the right to be a strong and empowered reader, and we ask that you continue to support us in empowering teachers and all stakeholders, parents, businesses, our researchers, our colleges, anyone that's in some way responsible for the outcomes of our students. You can find the Reading League Michigan online on Facebook, and we have a YouTube channel as well. We hope that you visit that often to look at previous learning opportunities that we've had. And moving forward, I just want to inform everyone that sometime in the spring, we will have the amazing Dr. Jane Ashby, who's done some amazing work in eye tracking research. So she will be with us sometime in April or May. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to our visiting researchers tonight, Dr. Christy Austin, Dr. Marissa Fildermen, and Alexis Boucher.
Hi, thank you so much for having us. I am Dr. Fildermen. I am really excited to be here with the Reading League today to talk about our manuscript. And I have with me Dr. Austin, who's at the University of Utah, and soon to be Dr. Boucher, who is at the University of Texas at Austin. So to get us started, what are we covering today? We are going to talk a little bit about the methodology of systematic reviews so that you can understand what are the different types of reviews, what are effect sizes in meta-analyses, and what are moderator analyses a little bit in more detail so that you can navigate that literature. We will also talk about what can you take away from reading a systematic review into your practice. We will talk about what those key findings were in this meta-analysis, and then how can those be implemented in practice. So it's sort of a two-parter. First, we're going to really go deep into the methods and how these systematic reviews are conducted and how ours was conducted. And then we'll talk about the results and implications as well as how to interpret those. So without further ado, soon to be Dr. Boucher is going to talk to us about the methods. And you might see her nodding. That's in case I don't advance the slide and she wants me to, but I'll try to keep up.
That's great. I'm really excited to be here. Thank you for attending either in real time or online, watching later. I also wanted to invite Marissa and Christy to jump in if I breeze past something we think could use more elaboration. So something to really bridge the research to practice gap is really understanding the methods we took to describe the literature that exists on our topic of interest. So in general, we consider these collections of primary research to be called systematic reviews. There are typically two main ones that we come across in research. One is a meta-analysis, which is what we'll be talking about today. And that one is more of a quantitative summary of all, with an asterisk there. Every effort is made to identify studies, but we go to pretty extensive efforts, but there's always room for human error, but we try to minimize that to the greatest extent possible. So we are trying to capture all the studies that people have conducted on a certain topic so that we can better understand that area of reading research in this particular case. You also might have come across a synthesis, and this is also a summary of the primary research that has been conducted on a topic, but this is done in more of a narrative way and doesn't always include numbers. Sometimes it does. That's what you can expect with those terms you see. We carry out an electronic search of databases to really find these studies using university-based libraries typically. We work with research librarians to really, it's weird not to have your presenter notes in the same screen. So if you see me looking over here, that's what's happening. So we work with research librarians who for their expertise is in actually making sure that we don't miss any studies. So these terms are actually chosen very carefully with the support of someone who is an expert in doing this. We type them into the library database. These were the particular databases we examined, listed here. They only mean a lot to you if you're looking at libraries, so I won't go too far into that. We chose to start in 1975 based on special education legislation, and this the search is current up until March 2020. It actually takes quite a while to read through the results, so that's why you'll see sometimes a gap in the date from when it was run to when it was published. The peer review process is also can be slow as well. So that's why you sometimes see that gap happening in dates from when it was published to when the search was conducted. Let's see. We also engage in a hand search, and this is just another measure we take to ensure that we're not missing any studies. That's sort of the whole goal of this process, is to be as thorough as possible. A hand search is sort of an outdated term because now that everything's digital, but we basically go through the table of contents of journals that are likely to publish this, or journals that reflect where most of our studies are coming from that do fit our criteria. And so we're looking at the table of contents to make sure that the databases didn't fail us in identifying a study that meets our topic. We also do something called an ancestral review, which is where you examine the reference pages of each manuscript that is included already. And we make sure that, again, there are no studies within the reference pages of each qualifying study to make sure, again, that we just haven't missed anything. We really want to be thorough in our approach. Something really important for consumers of research to look at is the inclusion criteria. That'll help you understand the population of studies we're likely to capture and describe. So we limited our search to peer-reviewed articles to make sure somebody else had eyes on that. That's a respectable study. That's kind of the process we engage in the research world. Dissertations, reports from educational entities and other places. It needed to be written in English because that's the language that we are, skilled in reading. We stuck to experimental and quasi-experimental designs. So looking at group design research, our students had to be the participants that were included in the actual individual primary research studies were those that were identified by the authors as struggling readers. And they were those individuals in grades 3 through 12. And then the dependent variable or the outcome of interest should be reading comprehension so that we can, describe the impact of intervention on reading comprehension. And we really wanted to isolate the effects of reading of comprehension instruction only. It gets a little confusing when we have a multi-component. We don't know what's responsible for the reported results. So isolating it just to focus solely on comprehension helps us to really better understand what we're describing. This is something you'll often see depending upon page limits of specific journals. This is called a PRISMA, and this really documents the process we undertook. And it tells you numbers associated with studies that did not fit our criteria. So it's sort of an accountability chart to show you, here's the results that we were given. Here's where these studies were excluded because they did not fit our inclusion criteria that I just introduced. It starts by looking at abstracts and titles. Sometimes there is excluding information right there. We'll see single subject, for example, that didn't meet our inclusion criteria, and that study no longer moves forward. Now, some of our inclusion criteria requires us to actually lay eyes on the whole manuscript and really understand what happened. So in cases, once we've gone through sort of the abstracts and titles and had those maybes, studies that were likely to fit our topic. We then carry on with a full text review of all the studies that are likely or that are likely to fit our topic, because we can still find information sometimes at the full text level that tells us, this study doesn't quite capture what we're trying to describe here. And then let's see what else. Also, the studies might be added from the hand search or the ancestral search. So we show that some came from the electronic database and some came from those other measures, search measures we took. Then we engage in a very fun activity called coding. And that's where we really work to establish reliability. The whole point of coding studies is to extract the relevant information. What do we need to know about these studies to best describe the research on this topic? So it's really important that we engage in reliability training so that we begin to think alike. That's the goal of that, so that when we encounter a study, we extract the same information, we perceive it as fitting our topic in the same way. So great efforts are taken to ensure that we approach the primary research in the same way, extracting the same relevant information, making sure that we all understand the statistics needed to calculate an effect size, for example, and things like that. So these are some of the code sheets, some of the variables that we coded for. It looks crazy like this. And if you're thinking, oh my goodness, it's so easy to make a mistake, we have an active workbook sheet and then a final product sheet. And we engage in something called double coding to ensure that what one author thinks is relevant information or the right information to extract from a study is the same information that somebody else would extract as well. In addition to that, it also allows for correction of human error. You type the wrong number by accident. All these things can happen because we're not computers, we're not machines, we're humans. So this double coding procedure allows us to verify what we actually took from the study is accurate.
Thank you. So that was an overview of the methodology, that process that Alexis talked us through is a quite lengthy process and very extensive. We looked at over 15,000 articles between us and narrowed it down to, I think it was 64 studies that were in the final number of studies. So just keep that in mind. So for this study, we really based it on these theoretical models of reading that we're not going to spend too much time on, but these theoretical models demonstrate the constructs and skills that are needed in order to make reading comprehension possible. But prior research in reading theory don't provide guidance about the relative effects of each of those constructs or skills. So that's why we, as Alexis discussed, we looked at reading interventions that provided reading comprehension intervention in isolation. And then just a disclaimer, we do not advocate for or endorse single component reading comprehension intervention. This is just so that we could understand those active components of comprehension interventions in order to support the reading comprehension component of a multi-component intervention. So conducting a meta-analysis allowed us to do this in a statistical manner. So we asked two research questions. What are the effects of single component reading comprehension interventions on the reading comprehension outcomes of 3rd through 12th grade struggling readers? And then to what extent do participant intervention and study characteristics moderate the effects? So across all of the studies, a majority of students were in upper elementary grades, middle to middle upper socioeconomic status, and at risk rather than identified with a disability. And what this information really tells you is for whom does this study mostly apply? And we also break it down a little bit by participant grade level a little bit later so that we can understand that a little bit more. So the main findings are called an effect size. So The average effect compares the treatment to the control, and it's measured in standard deviations. So what you see here are two normal curves. That middle point is the mean of those curves. One of those curves represents the treatment, and one of those curves represents the control. When we are talking about in effect size, we're talking about what is the distance between those means. And then we're asking, are they significantly different? So are they different enough that it is probably not due to chance? So in general, 0.2 is considered small, 0.5 is considered medium, and 0.8 is considered large. These are from like 1988. They're pretty standard measures, but in special education research in particular, effects as small as 0.2 are meaningful. So there are these sort of gold standard ideas of what is a small, medium, and large effect, but keep in mind that those differ across fields. In the special education field, 0.2 is a very meaningful effect. So you can see highlighted here the effects that we found of 0.59 and 0.36. They might be considered at that middle level, that medium effect. But when we're thinking about the population that we examined, those students who are struggling, these are quite large for reading comprehension intervention in particular. So what we're talking about here, that G, that's that difference between the effects from the treatment to the control with those normal curves. Now, when we look at the p-value, that's where we see whether that effect size is significant. That means that it is not due to chance. So we see here that the effect size for immediate effects is significant. That means that it's below 0.05. There's less than a 5% chance that it is due to a sampling error. That means that the difference between the treatment and control was likely not due to chance. So that's a very meaningful effect size, and it's also statistically significant. So now this statistic is called tau squared. And what this tells you is how much those effect sizes differ from each other. It tells us about the heterogeneity between the studies. That's those differences between studies. Moderator analyses can help us to understand some of that heterogeneity between the studies. That's the goal of a moderator analysis, is to reduce the variance between the studies. So we can see here that this moderator analysis, that this tau squared is 0.31, which means that moderator analyses would be helpful in understanding that. This ranges from 0 to 1. So this is not a huge amount of heterogeneity, but it is enough to explore. So with moderator variables, we did reduce that heterogeneity, and we also found some significant moderators of those effects. So moderators are based on variables of interest. These are chosen based on things that we think might alter the effects or the impact of that intervention, as well as they can be derived from theory. So there's reason to expect that a reading comprehension only intervention might differ with elementary versus secondary students. However, we found that that was not the case. So 30 studies included secondary students, 25 included elementary, and the remaining studies did not report the exact grade level. This did not moderate the effects, but it was still controlled for in the model. So a meta-regression model puts everything in one model. So you can see here the slope for participant characteristics is 0.05, and that is not significant. It is above 0.05. we cannot say whether it's due to chance. Then we looked at study characteristics. So the mean quality rating across those indicators was 0.97. The mean quality rating for research design, and these were on a scale of 0 to 2. So the mean quality, with 0 being low quality, 2 being high quality. So we had overall 0.97. The mean quality for research design was 1.58. And then for comparison group instruction was 0.95. And for implementation fidelity was 0.38. That did not moderate the effects either, but again was included in our model. Finally, we looked at intervention characteristics. This is where it gets juicy. So intervention characteristics, background knowledge significantly influenced the results. We know that because the p-value here is less than 0.05, it's likely not due to chance. Because the slope is positive, it means that students in the treatment who received background knowledge instruction had better outcomes than students who did not receive background knowledge instruction. Caveat and disclaimer, because all of the other variables are included in this model, we cannot interpret the slope beyond that. All we can say from the slope is that students who received background knowledge instruction performed better than students who did not. However, we can look at the average effect to get an idea of how the students in that subset of studies that included that variable performed. So here we have an average effect of 0.55 for this subset of studies. So for students who received background knowledge instruction, the average effect was 0.55. It's basically a mini meta-analysis. Breaking that down by vocabulary and content knowledge, the effects of content knowledge appear to be larger at an average effect of 0.64 compared to vocabulary with an average effect of 0.39. However, we did not compare those statistically. So this is just eyeballing, but this is just to give us an idea. 11 studies included only background knowledge without strategy instruction, and that was not a significant moderator of effects. The average effect of those studies, however, was 0.59. And so it's possible that this moderator was underpowered. What that means is that we didn't have enough studies in order to determine whether background knowledge without strategy instruction was effective. So there is a need for further research on that topic. Here, we have strategy instruction, which was significant, with students who received strategy instruction only having significantly better outcomes than students who did not receive strategy instruction only. The average effect for these students who received strategy instruction only was 0.69. And then when we break that down by each of those categories, the effects range from 0.47 to 0.72. Text structure had the lowest effect size, and main idea had the largest. Again, this is just looking at the average effects here. This isn't a statistical test comparing them, unlike those other effects that I'm talking about. You can tell it's a statistical test when there's that p-value. Metacognitive instruction did not have an effect on reading comprehension outcomes. The average effect of those studies was 0.49. 29 studies included instructional enhancements, and students who received this type of instruction actually did comparatively worse. But something to consider is that we're controlling for all of those other variables within that model. So it is not necessarily, it doesn't mean that providing graphic organizers or technology is a bad thing. What it means is that it has less of an impact on student learning than the other moderators that are being considered. The average effect for these studies was 0.45. Also, you can see just by eyeballing it, that's the lower effect. Breaking it down by enhancement type, we see that they're pretty similar. And so there were only 10 studies that included that technology support. So this could also be an area that requires further research. And then finally, we did measure type. So we looked at standardized versus researcher-developed measures. Remember that studies could include more than one outcome. So some studies included both types of measure, but we looked by measure, by effect size. So the type of measurement significantly moderated effects, with students performing worse on standardized measures. And those effects, when we eyeball them, are also pretty significantly different. Well, they're pretty different. We know that they're significantly different because of that p-value. When we're just looking at those effects, we can also see that they're very different. So researcher-developed tools had an average effect of 0.73, and standardized tools had an average effect of 0.28. This is expected in education research, and is it's because researcher-developed tools tend to be very directly aligned with the intervention that's being delivered. But the reason why we included it was really to control for that difference. By putting it in the model, we can control for that. So to summarize, there were significant immediate effects of 0.59 for reading comprehension intervention on reading comprehension outcomes. There was not a significant effect for that delayed post-test. There were not very many studies that included a delayed post-test. So that is something that warrants further research. And then when we're looking at those moderators of the effects, grade level did not moderate effects. Intervention characteristics, specifically background knowledge, strategy instruction only, instructional enhancements, and measure type, all significantly moderated the effects. And then study quality did not. So there were several limitations specific to this review, as well as the studies themselves. There were few studies of background knowledge alone, as I mentioned. So this is an area that researchers are investigating, and it's a very important one. And then also research that strategically pairs background knowledge with strategy instruction is also very important in order to understand what is most effective. There were few delayed post-tests, so we don't know how these instructional methods support long-term reading comprehension. That's something else that we'll need to look into. And then a lot of studies didn't report fidelity of implementation. That means that they did not tell us whether the interventions were conducted as intended. So stronger conclusions might be able to be drawn if studies were to report this. So these are some things that we're going to continue working on as a field. And with that, I am going to hand it over to Dr. Austin.
Hey, I'm Christy Austin. I am from the University of Utah, and I'm really glad to be here. I get to talk about the fun stuff. I get to talk about how this relates to instruction. And so what we're really trying to do here is say, like, how do the results of this meta-analysis inform practice, and what does this mean for classroom instruction? And, knowing that, some of these things we don't have clear answers on, right? But we do have enough information to guide what should we be doing. So I'm going to be talking about how the results can inform practice. I'm really going to be looking at what we found overall and then trying to translate that into what does that mean for teachers. And so, what we found overall was this idea that interventions that included instructional enhancements like graphic organizers or using technology demonstrated significantly lower effects than interventions that either built background knowledge or use strategy type instructions to help students comprehend text better. We also found that these metacognitive approaches did not significantly moderate the effects of comprehension interventions. And so from all of that, what we can say is like these findings really suggest that the effects of comprehension interventions focused on building background knowledge and teaching strategies to understand text might be the most effective approach. So we really want to focus in on those things that we know really work. And the things that we know really work are building background knowledge explicitly and teaching students strategies to help support their comprehension. And so that's what we're going to focus in on today, of what that looks like in practice. So, based on these findings, there's some sort of important implications for teachers. One being that, reading comprehension is really supported by an instructional focus focus on building background knowledge and explicitly building key vocabulary or academic vocabulary. And then finally integrating that type of instruction with then using these strategies to support reading for understanding. And so we're going to focus on what this can look like in practice before, during, and after reading. So there's these sort of practices teachers can implement along the way. They can plan instruction. They have some things they can pre-teach before students read. They have some supporting activities that they can do during reading. And then of course, some wrap-up activities they can do after reading. So before reading, one of the things that teachers can do to support comprehension is to build background knowledge and vocabulary. And so, one of the things that we recommend that teachers do is to select a passage that fits within a larger unit of study. And this is to help students build really deep background knowledge about critical sort of topics in these content area classes. And so, we know that one of the things that happens to students, we focused our meta-analysis on grades 3 through 12. And one of the things that happens as students sort of enter third or fourth grade, somewhere around there, is that they transition from really simple texts into more complex texts. And so, when they're reading these complex texts, a lot of times there's a lot of background knowledge and vocabulary knowledge needed to understand those texts. The vocabulary increases significantly, and we have to be purposeful about how we teach that type of knowledge and that type of vocabulary to students. And so, we are going to demonstrate what that looks like using a passage. And so I'm not going to have you guys read this today, and I'm not going to read it to you because I think that wouldn't be the best use of our time. But I think, we use this passage to demonstrate that there is benefit in selecting a passage that fits within a larger unit of study. And so this passage is called Traveling West. The purpose of selecting this passage and using it today is to demonstrate that this is one passage about the difficulties that early colonists had, traveling west and westward expansion in the United States, and that this would fit into a larger unit of study talking about sort of the early colonization of the United States and the westward expansion. And so this was just one passage that would lend itself to students developing deep background knowledge and vocabulary related to this topic. And so, before reading, there are two instructional steps that we sort of recommend based on this idea of building students' background knowledge and vocabulary. And so, the first step, of course, is that if you're going to select a passage that fits within a larger unit of study, it's really helpful for students if you continuously come back to the unit's big idea. So, it's kind of this essential understanding you're hoping students walk away with related to the unit of study. And so that's sort of the first step, is to summarize the unit's big idea and to make that very apparent to students, to constantly bring them back to that big idea so they remember how what they're learning today fits into the bigger picture of what you're hoping that they take from the larger unit. And then the second step then is to connect students, the students' new learning that they're going to read about today, what they're going to take from this reading, and you want to connect it with their prior learning so that they're constantly sort of reviewing how what they're currently reading about fits within the larger picture. So, for the purpose of Traveling West, this was a passage about, the exploration of the, Western United States by early colonists. And you might remind students of the big idea. That might look like telling students something like, throughout this unit, we'll be learning about westward expansion, how people settled the land west of the Mississippi River in early America, and then connecting their learning today to the learning of the larger unit. So last lesson, we learned about the reasons why early settlers wanted to expand west, to acquire new land to farm, raise cattle, and accumulate wealth. And so I'm just connecting what we're going to learn today. Like, hey, we're going to talk about the westward expansion. Last time, remember, we learned about, the reasons that we were, moving west in the United States. And so, let's continue on and think about what we're going to learn today. So before reading, I want to explicitly teach the academic vocabulary, knowing that building background knowledge and vocabulary is one of the things that we found was really effective for improving comprehension outcomes. And so, my recommendation would be for a particular passage or a reading that's sort of content rich, you want to select 2 to 3 academic vocabulary words, as this is kind of like the just right level for, it's not too many where it overwhelms students, but it's not just focused on one where students are capable of more learning than that. And so select 2 to 3 academic vocabulary words that you think are critical to understanding this passage. And so, for this passage, we went ahead and we underlined a few. And so here, I think the key here is that you are looking for words that are really critical to understanding this passage, but you're also trying to consider words that are, have high utility across content areas. So, when I think about the words we selected here, we picked words like obstacle, essential, encountered. They're really relevant to this passage related to the westward expansion, but you would also see these words across all content areas, right? I mean, you would see these words in social studies, you would see them in science, they would come up in ELA narrative texts, and of course they're used also in expository texts. And so, you really want to focus on those words that are high utility, but also represent the academic vocabulary of mature language users. So, to teach these, there's a million different ways that you can teach vocabulary. We just wanted to model one way, and there's some graphic organizers that I'm going to link you guys to here in a minute. But this is one example of a graphic organizer that you could create. And so, the key here is to teach this vocabulary. You have the vocabulary word somewhere on the page because you want to give students sort of an orthographic representation of that word. You want to make sure you're saying it aloud so they're getting a phonological representation. And then you want some sort of student-friendly definition. And I think the idea of something being student-friendly is important here because one of the things that happens is if you just go to like Merriam-Webster dictionary, sometimes the definitions listed are even more complicated than what we could just come up with ourselves, right? And so we can do better than what's in the dictionary sometimes. If you have trouble coming up with this, I love a resource called learnersdictionary.com. It's I think made specifically for students. Maybe Alexis and Marissa, if one of you want to type that in the chat, it's learners with an S on the end, dictionary.com. And I think that would be helpful for teachers. But that's where I get my student-friendly definitions from. And sometimes we can make them even more simple than what we can find there. And so here the word was obstacle. You would tell students the word is obstacle, have them repeat it. You want to have those students feel that word in their mouth and use it as many times as possible. So the word is obstacle. What word? Obstacle. An obstacle is something that makes it hard to do something. And so then you would want to have this picture that represents the meaning of that word. And you would want to use that picture to demonstrate the meaning of that word. And these pictures can serve as a mnemonic, right? And so when we think of a mnemonic, it's just anything that aids memory. When you have students see the word obstacle, you are hoping that they generate an image of this picture in their own head. And that's going to help them recall the definition of obstacle. And so, you want to say, in my picture, you can see that there is an obstacle in the road. An obstacle is something that makes it hard to do something. The big, huge boulder that you see in the road is an obstacle, and it's going to make it difficult for cars to travel on that road. So, I could also give an example of an obstacle that I've had to overcome in my own life. Like, an obstacle that I've had to overcome is that, I have a really hard time going to sleep at night because I start worrying. And because that's an obstacle, sometimes I wake up really tired in the morning and I've had to figure out ways to calm myself down. And then you cue students to practice using this word in a sentence. And you could say to students, can you please turn and tell a partner an obstacle that you've had to overcome? And you can start your sentence with, an obstacle I have had to overcome is. And so, having this sentence starter can be really helpful for students who do not have really strong language skills, because sometimes, what we will find if we don't provide these sentence starters is students have sort of a general idea of what these words mean, but they don't have a good sense of, the parts of speech or how to use them appropriately. And so, having this scaffold for struggling readers or struggling learners can be really difficult. And you could go through this same sort of routine with words like essential or encounter. And I'm not going to walk you through that, but you guys get the right idea, right? The idea is the word, a student-friendly definition, a picture, and then using those words in a sentence. So, before reading, so then you've now let's recap. So we've purposefully picked an article or a passage that relates to a larger unit of study. We selected Traveling West. We've explicitly taught those high utility vocabulary words that we hope that students, are able to understand, because that is going to support their comprehension of that passage. The next step that you want to do is explicitly build background knowledge. And so again, this is all before reading. Students have not even read this passage yet. And so, one of the things that I suggest if you are in these content area classes is that visuals can be really effective to help provide students with important information that they need to know prior to reading the text. And then, of course, right before reading, we want to offer a comprehension question to students that provides a purpose for reading. And so let's take a look at what that looks like. So, for this particular passage of traveling west, I think it's really helpful for students if we provided a map, right? Because we're talking about the early colonization of America. And what we know about, those 13 colonies is that America looked really different then than it does today, right? And so students might be sort of in their head thinking about a current map of the United States, the 50 states of the United States. And we want to provide them with some knowledge that, hey, the map of the United States looked really different a long time ago. And so, you could use this map and you could say to students something along the lines of, remember that the early colonists originally settled the 13 colonies on the eastern coast of the United States here. After they traveled west to settle larger areas of land. And so you'd talk about, here's the East Coast, and then they're going to travel west, and what the West Coast looks like and what they might have, what direction they were heading. And then you want to provide a comprehension question. And so one of the things that we have found through research is that students understand what they read better when you offer a purpose for reading, when they know that they're reading for a particular purpose and that purpose has meaning, which it's also helpful when the passage you're having them read fits into a larger unit of study. And so for this step, you could say something to students along the lines of, while you are reading, consider the following question: what struggles did the early colonists face as they traveled westward? And I'm offering that question because that's what this passage is about. This whole passage talks about the difficulties and challenges that early colonists had when they traveled west. So now we're going to move on to during reading. During reading, there are practices that we can engage in that help support reading for understanding. And we have purposefully selected a couple of our comprehension strategies. And we used the findings from our meta-analysis to pick out some of these comprehension strategies that had the largest effects for students. And so we selected the strategy of get the gist, because this is a main idea strategy, and main idea generated a really robust effect size for students. And so, one of the things of get the gist, and so I'm going to put into the chat a link for you all. And so, I want to offer credit to Middle School Matters, because these materials come from Middle School Matters. And that's a link, and they've made their resources, if you like the way these look, they've made these resources publicly available to teachers, and they've made them really user friendly. And so they are PDFs that allow you to just sort of type in them. And you will also find great if you teach the upper grades. My example of vocabulary sort of word meaning cards looked like something you might use in like the elementary grades. If you teach middle school or high school, there are some really excellent models for vocabulary templates that you could use that are just, you can type in there, you can drag and drop pictures into them, and they're super. So I encourage you to check out that website. But these during reading practices that we're going to model are this get the gist strategy. And this is just a strategy to help students identify the main idea of a passage. And so what we don't want to do is have students read through a really long, extensive passage and get to the end and realize that they do not know what they've read. And I think this happens to all of us. This happens to students who are, like struggling readers. But I mean, how many times as a proficient reader, an adult reader, do you find that you've read an entire passage and your mind was kind of drifting elsewhere and you don't even know what you read? And as adult readers, we know what to do. We use some fix-up strategies. We say, oh, my mind was drifting. I'm going to go back and find the last thing I remembered. I'm going to reread, right? But one of the things that we can do to support students who are still developing that understanding of trying to figure out what they understand and when there's a lack of understanding is we can help them check in at sort of checkpoints along the way by identifying the main idea of the passages that they are reading. And so for this get the gist strategy, step one is to identify who or what this section is about. And this gist card is on that website. Step two is to say what's the most important thing about the who or the what. And then step three is to combine those two things to write a main idea statement. And we want to make sure that the gist is the main idea statement. We want that statement to include the most important information. We want it to leave out unnecessary details, but we do want that to be in a complete sentence. And so one of the things that happens to students here is that, students who struggle to identify the main idea oftentimes get sort of hung up on an interesting detail that's really exciting to them, right? Or students sometimes here struggle to put a main idea into a complete sentence. And we have found that the get the gist really drives students' attention to, hey, what is the most, who or what is this passage about? What's the most important thing about that? And what I have found really helps with this get the gist, because I've used this and taught it extensively, is when students come up with a really interesting detail, you can say to them, find where in your passage it talked about that. Can you underline where in your passage it talked about that? That was a really interesting point, but I notice you only underlined one tiny little part of your passage. I want us to think about what the big idea of this passage is. What's most important about this passage? And so that's kind of how I cue students. So an example of a gist statement might be students saying, who or what is this section about? This section was about traveling west. What was the most important information about the who or the what? It was hard and took a long time. And then students are going to combine those two ideas to make a complete sentence. And this is good practice for your students who are still developing their English language skills and their written expression skills. And so you would hope that students could combine these to say, traveling west was challenging and it took a long time, or traveling west was hard and it took a long time. And remember that in the beginning, you might want to break up the text for students. That was a gist statement on just a short section or just a short part of this text. We don't want students to read all the way to the end and realize they didn't understand. And so I've kind of broken this text up and I've demonstrated what 4 different gist statements could look like. They identify the who or the what, what's the most important thing about the who or the what, and then they write a gist statement. So, while you're doing this activity, students have the gist statement card, the cue card in front of them. They have their gist statement log where they're recording their gist statements. You would have one on a whiteboard or on a projector, and you would be recording one, and then they would also be recording one, while you are modeling, and you could then release students to do some partner work and work on these gist statements together. You in the beginning would have a lot of control and do a lot of modeling. You sort of gradually release responsibility to students, in the beginning, having students work with partners, and hopefully eventually students can do this really independently. But in the end, they have finished the passage and they have generated 4 gist statements. There are 4 different paragraphs in this passage, and they've generated 4 main idea statements about this passage. And so then you're gonna do some activities after reading to support comprehension of this passage. And so after reading, what we suggest is reviewing the vocabulary words. And here the review is focusing on the vocabulary as it applies to the passages students just read. So we taught the words generally speaking, but now we want to make sure that we are having students apply their knowledge of how this word related to the passage. And so you would remind students, somebody remind me, what's this word? And they're gonna say it, right? I mean, we're releasing more responsibility to students. So they're gonna be able to say obstacle. Let's read what an obstacle is together and remind us. An obstacle is something that makes it hard to do something. So, our picture of a rock is an obstacle in the road that prevents cars from passing on the road. Can anyone name an obstacle that the settlers might have faced during their journey west? And then you might have students turn and talk, right? I'm not just asking one student to go ahead and provide an obstacle, because then I've really only checked in with one student. Instead, it's helpful if all students can participate in this. So turn and talk with a partner and tell your partner an obstacle that the settlers might have faced during their journey west. So remember, students have just read the passage. They've read all about this. Now you're relating this vocabulary to the passage at hand. For the word essential, you could ask students, why could settlers only take the essential items with them when they traveled west? We're hoping students come up with that idea that, travel was difficult. They traveled by, wagon, and there wasn't a lot of room, and a lot of families traveled together. And so they had to pick only the essential items. For encounter, you might say, who did the settlers travel with in case they encountered danger? And you hope they can come up with this idea that they traveled in groups. They had many families together, and so these questions help students relate the vocabulary to the passage at hand. And then after reading, and after you've reviewed those vocabulary words, oftentimes, particularly when we're working with students sort of in those upper elementary grades and beyond, students can really improve their comprehension, and it can be supported through written expression. And so we ask students to write a summary of the passage that they have just read. And it is so helpful for students to have those main idea statements, because that is going to help them generate a really effective summary of this passage. And so remember, the students have these 4 statements, and they are going to combine those to generate their summary paragraph of this passage that they have read. And so, it can be really helpful here. You might need to do some modeling, but it can be helpful here to tell students that they may need to combine sentences that are similar. to write a summary that follows a logical order and makes sense. Maybe there's a gist statement that looks a lot like the one right above it, and then you don't want to restate the same sentence sort of twice. And so, students can combine ideas. They might need to take one out. Those kinds of things can happen. But from here, students could use this gist statement and they could generate these gist statements, and they could generate this really cohesive paragraph that summarizes the passage at hand. So, they might come up with something along the lines of, there were many challenges and obstacles for early settlers who were traveling west. The journey could take a year or more, especially if a baby was born during the trip. Settlers had to fit all of their essential belongings into one wagon and travel with other families for safety. They were also slowed down when they encountered storms along the way. After they reached their destination in the West, early settlers created communities that grew into towns and cities. And so that is just taking these gist statements students have already written and making a cohesive paragraph. I've added a couple details that are interesting, right? And I could model how to do that. But you could see how this summary that students might generate is so much more rich than what they would generate if you just had students go and read this with a partner and then you said, write about what you learned. What you would get from the typical student in kind of the upper elementary to middle grades would be 1 or 2 sentences like, I learned about the settlers traveling west, right? And that would be like, hey, I'm glad you could identify the main idea, but like, what did you learn about them traveling west? What was important about that? And it didn't really give anybody any real takeaway from that passage. And so, to review these steps, the first idea is to summarize the unit's big idea. That's step 1. Summarize the unit's big idea. Step 2 is connect the new learning with students' prior learning. Step 3 is explicitly teach 2 to 3 academic vocabulary words that are critical to comprehending the passage and that are high utility across content areas. Step 4 is using a visual to provide students with that background information that might be critical to understanding the passage. Step 5 is providing a comprehension question to offer a purpose for reading, knowing that students' comprehension is improved if they're reading with a purpose. Step 6 is to write gist statements for every section of the text. And we could scaffold this. In the beginning, you might break up the text and put a little star where you want students to stop. In the end, you might ask them to kind of break up the text as they start to get better at it, to pick kind of paragraphs and separate paragraphs or sections of the text. The next step is to review the meaning of each vocabulary word and then have students or prompt students to answer a question that relates the meaning of that word to the passage at hand. And then the final step is for students to use their gist statements or their main idea statements to write a paragraph summarizing that passage. And so, these are kind of our takeaways. And there, of course, some of this is beyond the reach of what our meta-analysis could say. Some of this is, hey, us instilling research-based practices based on the findings of our meta-analysis. But this is what we really, would encourage teachers to think about for these content area passages that we know so many students and struggling readers have a hard time understanding. So I know there's been some questions throughout. We kind of kept rolling because we were switching about, but we do want to answer your questions. So should I just read them out? People can take a stab at them. So the first question I saw was from Leslie, and it says, if we teach background knowledge about a topic, kids will perform better in reading about that topic. Does this also mean that if we build general background overall, teach lots and lots of general knowledge, will their overall reading comprehension grow faster? Or is it just that if we teach a specific topic, kids will understand that topic itself better? Does building background knowledge in general overall itself raise reading comprehension? It's a really good question. You guys want me to try it first? I'm happy to take a stab at it. So
yeah, I mean, I would just say it's a little bit of both.
Yeah.
I'll let Christy explain that a little further.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the right question to be asking. The findings from our meta-analysis would suggest that it does have a significant effect on standardized measures as well, right? And so I think, teaching background knowledge alongside strategy instruction can be effective, to support, of course, it supports students' reading comprehension of passages related to that specific topic, but I think there is some preliminary evidence to suggest that it improves reading comprehension overall. And of course, if we are really mindful as teachers of selecting those most important topics, the students really need to understand, to build, wide and deep world knowledge, then we know that students over time are going to be learning about all of those topics that are really, really important. And, we can't teach everything, of course, there's some limitation to this, but we can suggest what are the things that students really need to master at each grade level. And I think if we sort of vertically align that information over time, we can make sure that students are leaving every grade with really deep content knowledge about the important topics.
And then there was another question about that main idea effect size. I did plop that into the chat. So we reviewed that. It's about 0.74. I can't remember the exact number, but that's what we mean by robust. So it's a large effect, both in that Cohen's manual, as well as particularly with our population of students.
Yeah, and I mean, to expand on some of that too, I think one of the things that happens in a lot of reading classrooms, and really well intentioned, and I was guilty of this as well, is that teachers sometimes they resort to strategy instruction as like this idea that the strategy itself is what's improving reading comprehension outcomes. And one of the things I think we wanted to emphasize, that I probably was supposed to say it in some of my slides, so I'm sorry, but I'm trying to say it now. So I mean, I think one of the things that we hope teachers can take away is this idea that, if you're not relating these strategies to having students really do a lot of practice reading connected text, if they're not applying these strategies reading connected text, the only way students are becoming better readers and are becoming more skilled and adept at comprehending the text at hand is if they are practicing. And they need to practice a lot, and they need a lot of practice, but they need a lot of practice building also that deep background knowledge, right? And so students, if we select these passages that relate to larger units of study, I think there's a lot of evidence to support that that's building students' content knowledge in a way that's going to help them grow as comprehenders. And that would be more effective than sort of this approach that teachers have taken of just selecting random passages and practicing a particular comprehension strategy. Marissa, I think you're headed out, right?
Yes, I'm headed out. Christy and Alexis are going to stay. If you have any questions, feel free to email me, or if you'd like to talk about it further. But I'm sure that I'm leaving you in good hands. So thank you again for having us.
And Marissa's email is also on the last slide. So you can feel free to reach out to her for questions too, if you had specific questions.
All right, thanks everybody.
Any other questions you guys have?
I would like to just thank you for this, because it's pretty affirming. So some of the basal programs right now are pretty intense, right, with the text complexity, but they still tend to focus around a strategy or a skill. And what we've really been trying to work on in my neck of the woods is having that text be the central focus, right? Yeah. So we've done a lot of work, particularly in the Wonders curriculum, of building what we call they're called background building slide decks. Yeah. And, so the teachers have them all built up we try to keep any video clips very, very short, so that it doesn't become about a video, but that background building, the visuals, vocabulary. And what's a beautiful thing about that collection is there's background building across it, almost like a knowledge scope and sequence. So they really ensure that the kids get the understanding of the text as a whole, rather than implementing some strategy. So it's been an interesting mind shift, and we've spent about 2 years doing that work, and I'm really moved by what you're saying.
Yeah, it sounds really powerful. I mean, I think that a lot of curriculums focus heavily on strategies without thinking about the knowledge students are also going to need, right? And I think teachers have moved in the direction of building vocabulary knowledge. I think most teachers, have kind of mastered that, but I think the idea of, it's really hard to comprehend a passage you don't have any background knowledge about, no matter how good of a reader you are, right? Yeah.
And I don't know if I'm kind of want to build off of something Rebecca's saying, something you're saying, and I'm trying to wrap my head around this, because in our school, for example, we use MESA, which is based on units of study. And so it is more teaching strategies based on disconnected text. And so after talking to Rebecca a lot and talking about content knowledge, and it's really hitting me that our kids don't have any content knowledge. There's nothing in our curriculum, I believe, that's building content knowledge, and especially not text-based content knowledge.
Yeah.
So when you're, so if, and Rebecca knows I said this the other night in a different call, for example, I took the opportunity for Black History Month to have the kids reading short passages, and it was kind of exciting to watch them go then on their own and take books from the library that were related to what we were talking about and what we were reading. But what you're talking about tonight, then I'm thinking, okay, so for example, next month, I want to do something on Women's History Month, but how this connected text, how long are you saying I'm not sure I can ask the question the way that I want to ask it, but how much time do they need in the text to build that knowledge, to build that background knowledge? Are we talking like a week of study on connected text? Are we talking 2 weeks? Are we talking a month? Does my question, do you understand what I'm trying to ask?
I think I do. Let me take a stab at it. So, I mean, I think one of the things your question made me think about is that right now in a lot of schools, English language arts teachers are bearing the brunt of teaching reading, right? And so, I mean, one of the things that we really like about these sort of steps that we've put together is that, I mean, we're all teachers of reading, right? A science teacher is a teacher of reading, a social studies teacher is a teacher of reading. And I don't know that it's so much about how long does it take. It's more about getting everybody on board with doing this. And if everybody's doing it, you know, science and social studies teachers, if they just spent 30 minutes 3 times a week, it would have such a huge impact on students' reading outcomes, right? I mean, think about the experience they would get reading nonfiction text for understanding, right? Because I mean, I think science and social studies teachers have all of this content to teach. And I think one of the key takeaways, what I like to tell these kinds of teachers is, you know, they're so worried about students mastering their content, but this is a really big bang for their buck. If students are able to read to understand, they will leave that classroom and continue to learn on their own through independent reading, right? So, I mean, this is a strategy that will pay off. It's an instructional strategy that will pay off tenfold, right? I mean, it will help students master so much more content than if the only way they can get the content knowledge is through media or watching a movie or, you know, those kinds of things.
And I appreciate your lifting the impact of writing to summarize it in a written way.
Yeah, I think it's really, really important.
There was a question in the chat. What would we suggest for interventions or parent supports to support improved comprehension skills so it's not a random passage practicing a skill or strategy?
Sure.
I think coming up with like sort of a theme of interest that is a new area of background knowledge and kind of getting a couple texts that go together, sort of building a theme so that the knowledge building is comprehensive. I think rather than worrying about teaching one text exhaustively, really building a wide variety, like more depth over breadth, really understanding a topic and maybe historical fiction alongside. Like it doesn't just have to be all the same type of book. We could have a historical fiction alongside a firsthand account, you know, and just sort of building that in dynamic ways so that they know how to encounter multiple text structures and thinking about content areas in dynamic ways. So
I think that's great too. And if you have parents that have less access to resources, I would encourage them to reach out to teachers. Teachers would love this question from a parent, right? And so like, just encourage them to contact you. Like if they know a topic their child is interested in and they want more resources about reading, to reach out to you for texts, appropriately leveled texts. Yeah. Any other questions? I wish state tests would reflect this research too. Yeah. Because I think that's one of the reasons that we've all started sort of selecting random passages and training these strategies, right? I mean, it's aligning with what students are expected to do on these state tests, but we know it's not how students become better comprehenders. So it's unfortunate.
Anything else from anyone? With that, I just want to say thank you so much for your time. Thank you for the gift that you've given us with your meta-analysis, and teachers and everyone supporting the Reading League. We just thank you for all you do and look for our upcoming event with Dr. Jane Ashby in the months to come. Thank you.
Excellent. And we, I think because Marissa left, the emails didn't get shared on the last slide. So we just put our 2 emails in there, and we're happy to connect you with Marissa as well. So just email us if you want to be connected. We'd love to hear from you.
Thank you.
Thank you guys so much.
Thank you.
Bye.